this starting now. One of the things I will say is in the small groups, I think you already know this, if the record is running and you go into small groups, it does not record the small groups. And so you never have to worry about that. I really want to, and some of you know in some classes, I or other professors will parachute into those meetings just to see if there's questions to be asked. To be honest with you, I probably will not do that. I want to reserve that time for your group to kind of feel comfortable getting to know each other and participate. But I'll always be open to any questions that come out of the conversation from that standpoint. Does that make sense to everyone? All right. Well, tonight we're going to kind of talk about some of the basic images that Sheldrake and some of the themes. I'm going to kind of start. Everybody can see the PowerPoint, right? And I'll say this again: you'll get a PDF of this at the end of the evening. I think John's and John, I hope you don't mind me calling you out. I've got 4 or 5 others here before it's all said and done. I think the frustration around, so what is spirituality, is one that actually is shared by a number of writers and thinkers. A case in point, this is Dean Blevins' Show and Tell. That's why I want everybody to see each other. There is a book that was written by and edited called The Study of Liturgy. And it is, it's older, but it is one of the classics of a kind of survey of the liturgical tradition and how that has expressed itself from the early church going forward. And starting with the basic notion of liturgy as the work of the people, and then thinking about liturgy associated with specifically, whether you call it worship or mass, but actually the gathering the people in a given point of time. Pretty easy to define liturgy from that standpoint. Though we may all have different understandings of it, at least we kind of go when we're talking about the liturgy of the church, most of the time we figure out how that works, right? Well, the same group of people that edited this book turned around and wrote a book called The Study of Spirituality. And so there's the red book and then there's the yellow book. And they really felt, in some ways, in their preface, they honestly admit that they felt convicted that after dedicating all that time to a study of liturgy, that they needed to pay more attention to what they would see life beyond just the worship experience. And they started to write this book. And this, I will say, this is one of the best handbooks that is still in print from that standpoint. But they they start in their preface and they write this. They say, spirituality, we confess, is a vague word, often used with no clear meaning and with a wide and vague significance. But we can think of no better single word to describe our subject. And in a way, this term that I mentioned last time that entered into our vernacular at the beginning of the 20th century has become a kind of very pervasive way of sort of describing the nature of who we are as human beings and our participation within the very life of God and what that looks like. But then what that looks like has been across, I mean, literally across the history of the study of Christian spirituality has often been, well, sort of like Jello, very hard to nail down from that standpoint. I'll give you my simple definition, and but I offer this, well, I guess the best way to say is very much humbly, not thinking this is the best definition, but it's a working definition for me. So I hope that makes sense. And so for me, spirituality is both life of and in the Spirit. What I mean by that, it is life of the Spirit as we understand the Spirit's work in our own creation and indeed across all of the created order. So whether you go back to Genesis with the Spirit hovering over the chaos, if you think about that imagery, or if you think about really the Spirit breathing life into the very nature of humanity, in some ways, all of the created order bears a stamp of the Spirit's work that's been, to me at least, part and parcel of what the created order is all about. I hope that makes sense to everyone. At time, yeah, John.
Um, you might go on to this, but is it a fair comparison to say that those writers wrote a book on liturgy, and then they thought they needed a book on spirituality, and so almost like liturgy and the worship that we do within the church is one aspect, and everything else is spirituality? Is that
I
how they
think
would put it?
I think they might struggle with everything else, but at least our participation to hear this language within the life of God. So there are a lot of things we do that I think they would neither count as liturgy or spirituality. They might have other ways of describing it, but at least those other aspects from that standpoint. And everything outside of liturgy really becomes a weird, I mean, even everything that we would call within the very life of God becomes really something that's pretty broad from that way of sort of understanding it. And I think that is, in some ways, just acknowledging life of the Spirit. In other words, that the Spirit is at work, and who we are as created beings, as we encounter that, then it is part of the stamp of who we are. This has made more sense at different points depending on your theological anthropology. So let me just name it that way. If you were a bipartite or tripartite type of understanding of the nature of persons. So if you, I mean, some of you have had other courses in theology or even psychology where they talk about Cartesian dualism, where they talk about the body, mind, divine bifurcation, and almost talk about them as different from each other. And if this were a class on psychology and theology, we spent a lot of time sort of unpacking that. Well, the same way that's there have been in the history of the church times where we have tended to think of human beings as body, mind, and spirit, or body, mind, and soul. And at times when that happens, then talking about this is almost as if there is one distinct aspect of who we are, sort of a third of who we are, or at least a third aspect of who we are, that this study is addressing from an anthropological standpoint, a theological anthropology, but still nevertheless an anthropological standpoint. And that life of the Spirit, for some people, gets condensed that direction all the way down to my spirit speaking to God's Spirit in some way. I tend not to use that tripartite view of humanity. So I'm just going to name that for what it is. I'm not going to spend a lot of time tonight on it. We might during convene, but I do believe that our very createdness in some ways is stamped in the Spirit of God. It seems to be the First Testament's acknowledgement of that. But it is also, to me, life in the Spirit, which is our ongoing participation in the work of the Spirit that begins, well, frankly, with Jesus and his own baptism in the Spirit, and then continues through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ and the ongoing presence of the Spirit of Christ as the work of the Holy Spirit in the world today. And so we not only are in some ways marked by the Spirit, however you want to think about that, as all creation is, but then we are invited into a participation with the work of the Spirit that is ongoing in the way the Spirit is constantly at work in creation and redemption, and even in sustaining who we are. To me, since I tend to be Trinitarian, that means that I'm invited into a participation with the very divine life of God in a very peculiar way. And that spirituality for me, from a theological standpoint, is every aspect of my life that is invited into that participation. But that may not be the way you think about Christian spirituality. And I want to remind you, you don't have to have that definition now. You have till the end of the semester to be working on this yourself. Okay. But I did at least want to give you at least one kind of operative definition that you will hear. And there are moments when I get excited about this. It's not life of and in the Spirit, but it's life in and of the Spirit. So I get them backwards every once in a while. But that's because, to me, who we are as part of the created order and how we participate in God's ongoing work of redemption and sustaining of that order and our own transformation as a part of that is always in conversation with each other in a very, very dynamic way. Does that make sense? And if some of you are going, I've never heard this kind of theological anthropology in my life, well, we'll wait till convene. Hopefully, you'll at least give me till then before we convey, we decide to convene a heresy trial. Let's put it that way. Okay. All right. I do think it's important, and I know several of you talked about the sort of the dialogue between of theology and spirituality, particularly Sandra Schneider's uh, sort of non-overlapping magisteria. They're really radically different versus someone like Bernard McGinn and others who do seem to think that there is a deep relatedness between those two disciplinary fields. Part of that goes back to early Catholicism, where everything was theology. And so some of you are in a class with me in Christian, that's a version of Christian ethics, that for many people, it's not Christian ethics, it's just moral theology. It's how they articulate that. And so it is an expression of theology. And there are people out there that when they begin to talk about Christian spirituality, they actually begin by talking about spiritual theology. That's their point of departure. Last Blevins show and tell when it comes to books, but a great example of this is a book titled Spiritual Traditions for the Contemporary Church, Robin Moss and Gabriel O'Donnell. Moss was Methodist, O'Donnell was Catholic. And I would argue this is still one of the best survey books in the way it's organized. I almost required this for the class, except the book was written in 1990. So the subtitle for the contemporary church doesn't seem to make any sense 30 years later. Does that make sense to everybody? Though all the work up to that point is pretty vibrant in the way in which they are trying to think about how these different spiritual traditions manifest themselves in the life of the church today. And their whole opening section in this book is really about, they call it spiritual theology. And so they begin at that point. So there really is varying ways of understanding how spirituality and theology interact with each other. And a lot of it, and this is important, depends on your definition of theology as much as it is your definition of spirituality. So if you think simple thing. So if you think you're struggling with the definition of spirituality, then all you need to do is very clearly define your definition of theology, and you'll be set in how you deal with this. And I'm certain everybody here has a very concise definition of theology that they work in, right? Okay, I'm messing with you, I know. Really, theology in and of itself has always been fascinating. How theologians conceive of their work. Let's say it that way. There are those who understand that theology is primarily an act of prayer or worship. I'm not going to do show and tell anymore, but there's some excellent books. Ken Leach wrote a book titled Experiencing God, who basically we'll look at a little bit later. And his notion of theology, it's a theology of Christian spirituality, but it really is a theology of prayer. That's how he begins his work. I know at least 3 or 4 major theologians that are a part of the Church of the Nazarene who have a vast command of the corpus of theology. But if you were to really push them to say, what is theology? They would begin by saying it's prayer. As a matter of fact, many of the early church fathers actually thought of it and conceived of it that way. Jeffrey Wainwright, who was a very famous Methodist theologian at Duke, wrote a comprehensive introduction to theology that he merely titled Doxology, because for him, all theology is merely an extension of worship. So, John, to go back, liturgy wins for Wainwright as a way of sort of defining how theology emerges. Now, there are others who think about theology not so much as just the act or expression of prayer or worship, but more as a kind of habitus, a kind of way of living in life. I traffic in practical theology, and there are those who might feel more comfortable in understanding Christian spirituality and theology as dialoguing with each other in this way. And I know Dr. Sheldrake talks about practical theology as one way of sort of thinking about the interaction. But frankly, even those who think of theology in a more rigorous, systematic scientia kind of scientia is a kind of way of understanding disciplined wisdom. They understand that discipline, discernment, that theoria, that they lift up as theology, is still something that has a kind of spiritual component to it. So throughout our conversations, we'll run into St. Thomas of Aquinas, for instance, and Aquinas his Summa is a really intriguing work because it represents a particular kind of scholastic theology, but you will find people like Etienne Gibson and others who basically say that what Aquinas was doing in his massive work was really trying to erect a kind of cathedral of theology to force people to look through the intricacies of that particular form of theology to see the majesty of God, much like cathedrals are designed in such a way when we walk into them, they're really designed to compel us to look up. But if you think of theology as a much more kind of disciplined art, if you will, then how you understand that in spirituality would be different from the habitus or even prayer. So I hope that's helpful in why there is varying ways in which theology and Christian spirituality interact with each other. Some other theological considerations really include, again, Leach's work, where he basically really makes the claim that there are various ways of thinking about Christian spirituality through theological lenses. One thing he says is just through the biblical narrative and the framework of the narrative, from First Testament to Jesus to Christ and then to the church, and to think about who we are as spiritual beings and what the spiritual life entails through those narratives that come from First Testament all the way to the New Testament, all the way to Revelation. But he then argues there are places where many times, and many writers who work within the fields of Christian spirituality, some of the people that you might be interested in reading as we go along, use very specific locations to name certain encounters. So that in a way, how we encounter God, how we find our way within the Spirit occurs in places like the desert, or through cloud and darkness, or through water or fire, or through flesh, through embodiment. He has a chapter on the Eucharistic God, the crucified God, the God of the abyss. He has one on God as Mother, which is really more thinking about the way God receives in the imagery within the Bible, but also in the God of justice. And that many times our approach to how we sort of live the life of and in the Spirit might be deeply influenced through any and all of these imagery in the way in which we appropriate those and use them. Any questions so far? All right, slide change. There are some other really kind of things that you have to work as you think about Christian spirituality from a theological perspective. Now, these are not exhaustive, but really these will be the things that sometimes we'll encounter when we are reading about certain spiritual writers, if you want to think about it that way, certain movements that occur within each of these 5 disciplinary domains that will or types, if you will, that we're working through. One is, how do we know God? And what does it mean to know God, to know enough about God that that we begin to understand who we are in light of who God is? And what is the nature of God's self-disclosure? How do we, each of us, sort of reconcile both general and special revelation? And what does that mean to each of us is one thing to think about. And even in special revelation, since we have tended in our tradition at times to think about that primarily through the canon of Scripture alone, what does it mean then at times for other traditions who actually see revelation, special revelation, ongoing beyond just the canon of Scripture, and to take that seriously as a part of their work? As a matter of fact, some religious orders would take other types of writings as is not the same as Scripture. I want you to hear that, but having a very unique contribution to how they help guide their understanding of the Christian life. That is not the same thing as what we might think of as devotional literature, but it has at least a more intermediary emphasis than just devotional literature from our perspective. Does that make sense? So how, theologically, how does God speak, and how do we know? Now that first version of know might be more knowing about the nature of who God is. But there is that deeper notion of knowing, that the Hebrew concept of knowing, the yada, that really talks about our intimate relationship with God. And how does that occur? Does it come through mediation? In other words, does it actually come to us through some forms of mediated forms, whether that be the sacraments or actually even Scripture? Do we actually expect us to literally experience the presence of God, and through that mediated form of reading Scripture? And how do we understand mediated versus other ways in which we might experience God that are quite intimate and occur almost absent of mediation from that standpoint? I think, John, you alluded to this one, this both inner and outer, and how do those relate to each other? Now, there are extremes of this, so I'm just going to name them. There are those who focus on the mediated to the point of what's called sacerdotalism, where all of a sudden God cannot move except out of certain media. But there are also times where experience is lifted up so high that you begin to get a sense of Platonic dualism, where it's almost as if God cannot be at work other than in the midst of that experience. And in some ways, we pursue that experience to the negation of the created order. So the end excludes the of as a result of that. Does that make sense to everyone? But those are theological concerns, and I'm stating at the beginning of the semester so that you can wrestle with them as you're reading some of the material. The role of the Trinity is important, particularly in how we practice the Christian life. I really want to say it this way, not so much as an abstract formulation, but in the relational work of the Trinity. How do we see that informing any of these practices that we're reading about? How is both God, Father, Son, and Spirit at work in and through the lived Christian life? Becomes one of the things for us to think about. And for me, it's very important because I tend to work out of a deeply relational Trinitarian model, and that's just to let you guys know that. But from that standpoint, to me, then all practices inherently are related practices, related to each other, to community, but ultimately in how God is at work in the midst of those. We do have to think about the nature of humanity and their capacity for transformation. We'll run into different visions of the Christian life. Some of you already know these from studies of the church that question whether humans have the capacity for change. And then we'll run into others that have a deep sense of the potential of what change might look like and how that's at work. And that nature of how we understand the nature of humanity leads to both formation and salvation. So as we participate within these spiritual practices, how are they both not only just shaping us, but also how do they tend to work from the standpoint of being a part of our salvation? Or are they elective and therefore not needed because of faith as opposed to works? And as we move through, one thing I want you to think about theologically is, do we do these activities, these different spiritual formation practices, if you will, do we participate within the life of the Spirit out of a response to God's first move of grace, and then we're invited into this? Or is it something that we do trying to prove ourselves before God of our own spirituality? And how we sort of resolve these questions of knowledge, the work of God, the nature of humanity, and the nature of salvation really are always underneath our reading and sometimes reaction to some of the work that we'll be involved in during the semester. Does this help? Any questions? Okay, either I'm doing really well or you guys are going, hey, hang in there. There's just an hour left. I mean, I'm not sure which one of those is winning at this point. Okay. Okay, well, let me roll on. We are dealing with two major movements tonight. You guys have already read about them. And one of them probably is Sheldrake he bails us out because I think he uses the language of discipline. But the technical term is ascesis, it's asceticism, and that would be in almost any other introduction, you would be really thinking about asceticism in the way in which he's talking about discipline or mysticism. And I will say that within the majority of the work in Christian spirituality, these are the two dominant approaches to the history of Christian spirituality and to the life therein. So much so that some books dedicate their entire study to just one of the aspects of these two over time. Some of this is just going to be reviewed from your reading, but really asceticism does focus on training and discipline. It's interesting that a lot of times, at least biblical imagery, we tend to associate with either military imagery or athletic imagery. Paul gives both of those. But actually, the entire sort of forming of the children of Israel in through a very formal practice, series of practices, if you will, sort of also reflect this kind of sense of order and ordering one's life in light of God's leadership. And so there is an emphasis on living out the Christian life in a disciplined fashion. The root source of this, particularly by the time we get to the New Testament church, not New Testament church, but the early Christian church after the New Testament, is through the imagery of martyrdom. And that this martyrdom is really understood as an expression of witness. So how do we prepare ourselves to both live and follow God, but also give faithful witness to God, become sort of the primary goals of the ascetic life? This goes back to last week's lecture, where one of the reasons, the way you think about Christian spirituality is, to what end do we do these practices? And for all of the sort of negative expressions of the early monastic period, particularly around the desert mothers and fathers, I got to be careful I don't get ahead of myself too far. And I'll talk more about it. Even those were moments of witness. Those were moments of actually doing something more than merely escaping Constantinianism in that period of time. Well, in contrast to that, or seemingly contrast, is this notion of mysticism, which begins to start with some idea that there is a spark, if you will, in the soul, something that's sort of woven into who we are, that moves us toward God. And yes, mysticism puts an emphasis on interiority and definitely upon this vision of being union with, or at least communion with, God. It really is the most important thing at the very core of our human existence. That is what we long for. And if you hear Augustine at that point, and that as we move into that engagement between God and the soul, if you will, that moment of deep communion often results in either divine illumination or divine darkness. And I'll explain those a little bit more in just a couple of minutes, okay? I tend to use Venn diagrams a lot because you cannot pit these as two really antithetical perspectives. They do have points of overlap. I mean, there are moments within the ascetic life that you get deep, deep engagement with the very presence of God as a result of that ascetic, that commitment to asceticism. In mysticism, as much as that's about almost a spontaneous encounter with God, you get a lot of descriptions about how that occurs that imply a particular way, a kind of way of engaging that divine spark, so that one might move into that deep communion. And so I hope you hear, even in mysticism, there are many times structures, often coming out of the mystic's encounter with the divine, as they articulate those encounters and how they occur. It's almost inevitable that they begin to suggest then how that might be possible with other people. And as much as asceticism is really about this kind of deep disciplined living, there are moments of deep encounter with God in the midst of that living. Does that make sense? And probably the hardest of the practices, I'll go ahead and name it, that we'll run into is contemplative prayer, because there are times when people write about contemplative prayer and you can't tell whether they're talking about asceticism or whether they're talking about mysticism, just in the way it's described. And I've read 2 or 3 books on contemplative prayer, including books by Merton and others. And there are moments as you're reading it, you're going, so where does this person fit within this conversation? Stephen, I'll just go ahead and say Sadhana, the book that you're reading right now, will probably also mess with these categories on occasion. And if for anyone who read Stephen's comment about starting to read DeMello's book and in bringing that into conversation, I'm going to take a moment just to remind everybody, you don't have to be reading that book right now. So, Stephen, just so you know, if you scared someone in the class, that's your fault, not mine. Everybody else, just remember those books are assigned reading after convene. So the minute you saw Stephen write that, if you went, did I miss something this week? No, you did not.
Professor Blevins, I just wanted to point out, when I found out what the book was, it seemed like a daily practice, read an exercise a day. And so that's kind of how I'm reading it. I'm kind of going through the practices. So that's part of the reason why I started so early.
I get that. And so I found that's fine. And anybody can do that with some of the other supplemental reads as well. I just all of a sudden, I didn't want to scare anyone in light of how the syllabus is constructed. So that we just pause for this brief commercial timeout to just say, you can do what Stephen does, but you don't have to do what Stephen does. Okay, just to bail him out, if nothing else.
Professor, I did have a question too.
Yeah.
Can these two concepts, asceticism and mysticism, can they be seen? Because how you're talking about them, and forgive me, the reading, I did do it, but I read it last week, so I'm kind of still refreshing myself right now. Can they play off of each other in a sense of, like, my mind goes instantly to mysticism, the spark would lead to someone moving into asceticism as a response to that spark. If that makes sense?
It does. And actually sometimes, and we see this in the history of Christian spirituality a lot, where certain mystical encounters tend to bring a community around that person, who then develop a very deliberative lifestyle and practice as a result of the accounts of that encounter. And that becomes a part of what happens in those moments. Probably the one thing that sort of distinguishes them, and I'm never helpful about absolutes in any of these traditions, is that at least the asceticism has with its intention the other. And I mean, the other, basically other people, in bearing witness to them or in caring for the poor. There is a kind of focus intent that causes people to want to live out that Christian life toward the other. But mystics at times sometimes found that they can be equally compassionate out of their experience, but it is really about this divine connection to God and the dwelling within that the possibilities of that kind of deep encounter with God that anchors what they think is vitally important as a part of their journey. Most mystics don't set out to become that. We have a few today who think they can go that way. Most mystics, this becomes for them an encounter they did not necessarily expect in that form, or at most they have read the accounts of other people and hear this language. They begin to adopt a particular way of living that suddenly includes these kinds of mystical encounters out of that. Does that make sense? And so I'm just trying to represent those. A little more about asceticism. I'll try to go through this pretty quick. While martyrdom may reflect the beginning of asceticism in early Christianity, it probably has some pretty deep roots in the Jewish tradition as well. I mean, the whole vision of John the Baptist and the Essene community, really also bear witness to communities that are gathered around a very given particular way of life. And John the Baptist, is a very interesting expression of that in both the New Testament as it bridges through First Testament vision. It really focuses on this particularity of way of life, and the question often is, what might be a given life for what reason? So why did these people embrace this particular type of discipline engagement? I do think that as martyrdom waned, and martyrdom is very crucial in the early church, mainly because of the persecution that was going on, martyrdom was not an option. Martyrdom was at times a potential outcome in any given moment. Martyrdom did not always mean death. It might mean just deprivation. But when you lived a faith that always had the chance of being challenged, then being prepared to provide witness in the midst of that challenge was just part of what the early church was about, and why that particular vision ultimately included sainthood. If you can think of both Polycarp, but also Perpetua and their martyrdoms, and how they bore witness in their faithfulness in the midst of those martyrdoms, became emulations, if you will, of how others might be martyrs. Now, in early church writings, you'll on occasion run into someone who will write saying, you don't become a martyr because you go looking for it, but as your witness is challenged, you are called to live out that martyrdom. And so particularly today, I think a lot of people who claim martyrdom are sometimes self-inflicted. Good famous Oklahoma term, they tend to shoot themselves in their own foot. But in that period, that wasn't the case. And so what happened is, as martyrdom began to wane, particularly as Constantinianism began to become the social environment of the Christian life, and I know there's been a lot of talk about Constantinian captivity. One way I'd still say it is that the social order of life became amenable to Christianity. Then where does one bear witness in that kind of society? And what does that look like? And it's not surprising that through the writing of the lives of Anthony and others, that I'm always going to mispronounce names. I think it's Evagrius wrote the lives of Anthony. You begin to get this image of monks or people. They would, in those days, they would just be called people that became the Desert Fathers. But these people who moved out into the wilderness to actually bear that witness once again, sort of emulating, if you will, both where did Jesus go out, and they would often go out into the wilderness to do battle with the devil. Just as Jesus faced the devil in his temptations, then obviously the wilderness was a prime place in which one would go out and through prayer do battle with the devil. It's one way to think about it. And this kind of desert imagery became created for probably the first group of what we might call Eremitic monks, or recluses is one way to think about it, that were both men, but I really want to say this, there were also desert mothers. There were women who then would go out and undergo real deep austerity as a part of their commitment, if you will, to undergo any kind of deprivation needed to give full witness to what God was about. Rarely did they go out there to go through that deprivation to necessarily get a vision of God, but they saw themselves as bearing witness to God as a part of that. And there are some pretty interesting stories. Pacoimus is a good example of even a whole community of monks who went through extreme modes of deprivation as a part of their attempt to live this out. What's important is that those desert fathers and mothers then would come back to villages and give account to how God was at work in their lives and during these periods. And it was in the villages then that communities would form around them. And that's how the earliest of early monastic orders sort of understood themselves. Does that make sense to everyone? Another example, much later, so we're talking much later in the history of Christian spirituality, are what we call the mendicant and anchorite communities that often gave themselves in living in poverty. The example of this, where they would discipline their lives toward poverty, St. Francis of Assisi may be one of the best examples of this. And that these were often communities on the move, if you will, that were not necessarily in monasteries somewhere, but sometimes they would also attach themselves individually and undergo privation as anchorites in certain communities, really dedicated their lives to a simple poverty, to help bear witness to the poverty of Christ and to invite people into this understanding of the nature of the Christian life. And the third group would probably be the Cenobitic communities. Anchorites, by the way, are people who tend to connect with the church individually and embrace a radical asceticism. Some of them would actually live in small cells, if you will, small rooms in a church alone and spend their entire life in solitude and at some level of deprivation. They didn't starve to death, but some level given over to prayer as a part of that. Some anchorites actually then chose to live beyond the church, and they would live more like hermits in the way in which they would live quite individually. Other monks tended to gather in communities, and those communities might be independent monasteries, but a lot of times they were also sometimes attached to cathedrals, and they would then order their life through disciplines of prayer and service. And this goes back as early as Augustine, the Bishop of Hippo, Augustine actually started out to be a monk. He got hijacked by the church in Hippo, and ultimately was appointed bishop there. And part of the condition of that was he could also create his own monastic order and maintain them as a part of the abbey or that was there in Hippo Regius. And so Augustine wound up at the end having sort of the best of both worlds from his perspective. So he could be a bishop, preacher, actively involved in the full life of the church, but he also almost ran an order that later became what we would call the Rule of Augustine. Is sort of, in a way, a kind of extension out of that. In other places, we'll run, if you were to kind of review the history, we're going to run into other people where the life of the monastery and the larger life of the church, be it a cathedral or just large churches, often overlap in very specific ways. But often these monks in this ascetical tradition would still give themselves over to a highly regimented way of living that would be reflective of how they understand one lived one's life in and through the church, through these orders. I hope this is resonating with everyone. I'm also paying attention to the clock, okay? And so the discipline to follow God entailed, well, discerning the challenges that one had to engage in order to bear proper witness, but also to order one's life and order it often in community. One of the things that I find fascinating is that most of the time, each of these monastic orders, and that's one way to think about them, these constellations of monks in certain places, began to adopt a rule that often was the accumulation of their early attempts of living life together that guides the community, and then first, and then the person second as a part of the community. And this rule really undergirds any disciplinary approach of how they lived. And I really want to say it this way. One thing we have to recognize is that these rules of order, these from Benedict going forward, really was that the tradition shaped the rule, not persons. And I know some of you are in the MDiv program at NTS where we encourage you to think about a rule of life, but that is a very modern notion. So in the early church, you did not think about what is my rule of devotion or my rule of life. You thought about whose order do I join? And the order that could be at times through the work of the abbot in conjunction with the monks or the abbess and the nuns might revise the rule, but the rule was always written with a social component first and then individual obedience to that social component. So I know, I think Stephen and Amber, both of you talked about surprised at the heavy emphasis on the social. That was just normal in the early church and actually normal prior to the Enlightenment. If you found somebody in Europe in the 13th century who was thinking about disciplining their life, they didn't sit down and say, so, how much time do I need to spend in prayer? And do I need to read scripture? And do I need to set aside 30 minutes in the morning? And do I need to pray in the evening? They wouldn't even think that way. They would say, which order do I join? Trusting that those rules would then provide the disciplinary of the community would guide them in their own disciplinary practice. And that's a really different way of understanding asceticism. So whether it was St. Benedict or Augustine, whether you you followed the constitutions within the Jesuit order set by St. Ignatius and exercised the spiritual exercises, whether you chose to follow St. Francis, or Sister Clare, the Order of the Poor Clares, or even if you were part of the Beguines, which was a lay order, those orders then guided your journey through discipline, not you setting that for yourself. It's interesting, even Wesley kind of got into this, and I'll provide an article if you're interested, that he not only revised devotion, he not only gave guidelines for what we would think of as devotional practices, but he also revised the discipline of the people called Methodists. He set an order. There was a reason they called them Methodists from the very beginning. And Wesley saw this as a responsibility to set an order before the Methodist people from that standpoint. Often people ask, in this kind of approach, do people really experience God? I mean, does this actually happen in this kind of deep kind of order? And most of the time, the response would really be one way to think about it is, yes, they do, but only as certain obstructions are removed by a kind of effort of will, if you would, through this kind of disciplinary practice, so that you can move away from the impediments of the world and you can move toward resources that would guide that encounter. And within the ascetic tradition, this training was training to both avoid the snares of the world, but also to embrace then practices that would guide one into a deeper understanding of who God is. And it's amazing how many times then things like vows of simplicity, if not poverty, become necessary to be part of an order from that standpoint. Okay, I'm going to pause. Any questions? Nope. All right.
Dr. Blevins.
Yes.
Do you have any examples of this sort of thing in the modern Church of the Nazarene, or evangelical denominations that we could point towards, like
Well, it is interesting.
not just like orders, but methods like Wesley had.
Yeah, not in Church Nazarene. So let me just name that. We are far too much indebted to a different form of piety, or a different vision of spirituality. Though some might argue that the covenant of Christian conduct might come pretty close. Particularly older versions of it that are often stated in the negative from that standpoint. But there have been, and I would just say what's really interesting, mainly I'll just talk about St. Benedict for a moment and the rule of Benedict. There recently has been a book written by Rowan Williams called The Way of Benedict, talking about both stability and order. And there are communities being shaped and formed right now of young people in England around that a revision of that Benedictine rule, which I find just fascinating from that standpoint. And that is not necessarily the same thing as other contemporary monastic traditions that are there, but really a real radical attempt to kind of rethink what the monastic life looks like as life together first through that. So I can try to find a couple of links to provide for you for that, but it's really been phenomenal how that one has sort of caught fire from that standpoint. The community in France that is dedicated to singing, and I just lost the name of it.
Taizé.
Yeah,
Taizé community.
Yeah, I do know there was an attempt to bring that ordered life, both the ordered life together as well as the singing. I mean, everybody likes the songs, but I'm talking about the ordered life. There was a very deliberative attempt to reintroduce that both in Canada and here in the United States. And that discussion was very robust. I think it had already begun to take root in Canada and was very robust about it coming to the US, but that was pre-COVID. So where that has gone since then, I just do not know. And there may be other, what I call spontaneous communities, but not necessarily in the same way. Those two expressions are really fresh in my mind from that standpoint. Okay. Well, let's talk a little bit about mysticism. I'll try to get through this in a hurry, watching the clock. Mysticism in its authentic form, and I am reading the slide just to keep me honest, moves out from individual experience to collective spirituality, and it kind of functions as an essential vivifying current. Got to read Michael Cox's work correctly, in the spiritual life of the whole church. Cox's book, A Handbook on Christian Spirituality, when you pick it up, you think you're going to get something, well, sort of like Sheldrake with different approaches. No, the whole handbook is nothing more than a straightforward accounting of mysticism. Because for Cox, that spark of the fire is the very thing that then begins to really enliven the whole life of the community in and through these very particular experiences. So this becomes a different way of thinking about what the Christian life looks like. So rather than the community providing guidance to the individual, it is the really dynamic expressions of the spirit that occur within certain people that begin to revivify the full life of the church, the full body, as a result of what's happened. And it's a radically different way of thinking about sainthood as a way of, at times, providing not just inspiration, but literally life to a given community in and through these dynamic, unique individuals from that standpoint. Examples include Pseudo Dionysius the Areopagite. I'm trying to go too fast. Also sometimes pronounced Areopagite. I've run into both of those. But others that we know better is Francis of Assisi, John of the Cross, Julian of Norwich, and there are many more. And often they inspired movements out of who they were. Bernard McGinn, you heard his name mentioned in Sheldrake's book, has written actually more on Christian mysticism than anyone I know. He has a 5-volume treatise, and then he's got several smaller treatments. So if you are interested in this particular approach, finding some of his work, I'd be careful about the foundations of mysticism. As you see, those are 5 pretty large books. And if you're going to do that, we'll talk about a PhD dissertation. But if you were thinking about exploring that more for this class, he does have smaller texts, and he is worth the read. Though I used Michael Cox to begin with, McGinn is really kind of one of the major articulators of why mystical encounters are so important. And hear this language for the life of the church, not merely for the mystics themselves. Okay. There are certain characteristics within mysticism. So that is, one sort of encounters the very presence of God. And as they write about this, sometimes those encounters come through suffering. Sometimes those encounters come through just prayer. Sometimes they come through other forms of Christian practice. Sometimes they just come. And then the person who has this encounter with God begins to make sense of that. But what do those encounters tend to look like? Usually there are at least 4 kind of qualities to a mystical encounter that helps us understand how the person is experiencing the very presence of God in their life. One is ineffability, that in some ways there's something about the nature of the encounter that is almost incapable of full description. At times may be almost literally unutterable. I mean, just aspects of it. And language only approximates at best what has happened to that person in the midst of that encounter. And as you read mystics, the way they describe those encounters sometimes just feels weird in light of normally evangelical piety. But it becomes fascinating because they are wrestling with trying to give some kind of expression to something that they themselves don't have the language to fully name. And they often borrow language that only at most approximates the nature of that experience. There is a kind of noetic quality. Noeticos is of the intellect, but what I mean here is that there's something about the way it is beyond just rational analysis. It's a kind of knowledge that's grasped at an intuitive level and with intense depth of perception. So this is a particular way of knowing that brings a kind of clarity that cannot merely be rationally explained, but actually moves beyond that. I think that's something that's really pretty fascinating out of mystical experiences. There is a sense of transiency, though, attached to it. Experience does not last long. It really sometimes occurs along a continuum of preparation and experience and reflection. And so someone may be in prayer, so they're in that, and all of a sudden this intense experience of the presence of God enters into their lives, and then they might dedicate years to reflecting upon that experience and trying to think about the fullness of what that is as a part of their life. And there is a sense of passivity, a feeling of something given, not earned. And so people tell you 4 foolproof ways to have a mystical experience, you're already knowing you're talking to a poser at that moment, because there is something about these experiences that they can't conjure up. And I'll be upfront, I've met young people engaged in exploring mysticism that basically at times play what I call I've got a secret game. And they'll kind of say, well, if you've had the kind of experience I've had, you wouldn't be asking those kinds of questions, kind of, or you would fully understand. And I hope you hear people who actually encounter God in that kind of level of depth. This is not something they feel that kind of possession over and something that they think that only they can possess in a particular way. It's grace. And they live their lives out of that grace. So it's a really powerful experience from that that. And the study of mysticism, the writings around this, often you'll find these qualities bubbling up in and through the writings themselves. There has been what's called the scala perfectionis. This is what happens when you begin to kind of say, how does one enter into the depth of these mystical encounters? And remember I said earlier where description then starts to sound like guidance. And there are times when mystical writers will write text trying to talk about how one might encounter God the same way they encountered him. Probably the person best known for this, but though not the only one, is Juan de la Cruz, St. John of the Cross, and particularly through his writing of the Ascent of Mount Carmel. And Benedict Groeschel, who is a committed Christian and a psychologist, was writing a book on the psychology of spiritual development. But more importantly, Groeschel was interested in how does one give account for these types of depth experiences. So it was a piece of that book. It's not the whole book. And he began to sort of look at Juan de la Cruz's treatise on the ascent of Mount Carmel from that standpoint. So how does one enter into this kind of engagement? And Groeschel, following Juan de la Cruz, says there seems to be sort of three layers of encounter, if you will. The first layer he calls purgation, which is a kind of detachment from the tyranny and the distortion of the senses. You probably can't see the small print in the diagram. This is literally a diagram that Juan de la Cruz included as a part of his treatise, visioning how one ascends. If you think about Moses going up Mount Carmel, and he says, well, the ascent does not happen this way. It does not happen this way. It does not happen this way. It does not happen this way. As a matter of fact, if you think this is how it's happening, God is not in those kinds of acts. And that is not the way in which one embraces the fullness. And instead, one has to get through the tyranny of the ordinary and the customary and the distortions. And going through that is indeed what Juan de la Cruz would call the first dark night of the soul, this sort of struggle to move past what is the ordinary and customary way we might think we would encounter God, and how not to allow ourselves to be seduced, not just by the sinful temptations in the world, but even out of our own attempts to sort of make our way into this encounter. Does that make sense to everybody? And out of that, there does become a moment of illumination. It's a specific and kind of pervading sense of the absolute that leads one to develop the inner life to the full. It's a kind of refinement. And people who write on contemplative prayer often talk about this level of depth of awareness, of illumination, and how that then we become aware of the very presence of God and how that literally illuminates the fullness of the life around ourselves. But that is not the final stage. Juan de la Cruz, having read Ascent Mount Carmel, then talks about a third stage that is that of union, which is a kind of perfect self-forgetting harmony with God. It's actually, this is the one place where a lot of people misrepresent the dark night of the soul. So if you hear that preached in the sermons and we're down the road, just hear what I'm about to say. Yeah, there is a dark night of struggle, but Juan de la Cruz thinks that once we move into this kind of encounter with God, God envelops our lives to the point that the second dark night is God's eclipse of the very light of the world around us. It's almost like a total solar eclipse in the way in which we enter into darkness here, but it's an enfolding darkness that holds us out of the embrace of God. What I've really found interesting is that in some writings of women, womb language begins to appear at this point as a way of thinking about that holding space as well. But it really is a kind of deep, deep encounter with God where it's not absorption into God. I really want you to hear the people who are writing this are Christians, and very dedicated. So you have John of the Cross, who is mendicant. He is a begging monk, raising money for the poor, but he is also, because of his influence of Teresa of Avila, or Teresa of Jesus is actually the other name she's known as. So that there is this kind of deep encounter of God that can be reached if we're willing to live a life of prayer in such a way, not merely just to deny ourselves, but to find this fullness of union with God. And for John of the Cross, this was something that was attainable, probably spoken out of his own life and experience. But it is a kind of fascinating way of thinking about what the Christian life looks like and what Christian spirituality looks like when it's not merely just an experience of God in my life, but suddenly my life is woven into the very nature of who God is. And for John of the Cross, it wasn't a loss of personality or identity in that. It was just that I am fully held and enveloped within the fullness of the love of God. And I want you to hear that language that way. It's a fascinating treatise within the field of mysticism in a way in which it expresses itself. What's really important, though, is this notion that I can't make this happen. As a matter of fact, it is all about what I can't do and coming to the ends of my ability to make this happen, that fully this becomes possible. And so for him, individual striving for this is self-defeating. But nevertheless, we often have to do that because we're wired for that, so that we can come to the ends of those efforts in order to find where God begins to meet us and draw us into this deeper life, first through clarity and ultimately through union. That is sort of Juan de la Cruz's vision of what the mystical journey looks like. Queries? All right. I've started using language, and I'm going to introduce this to you tonight at 7:40, take about 10 minutes. We will revisit this particularly during Convene. This comes out of the work of Urban T. Holmes, and Holmes wrote an analytic history of Christian spirituality, and he began to talk about how do we chart and create an ecology of spirituality. So Holmes is trying to think about this sort of like Sheldrake's 5 types, but he was trying to think about, so how do these different spiritual writings function and how do they represent themselves? And he started by creating 2 axes. One axis is the speculative and the affective. And what he means by that is the speculative is the use of the mind or the will. So, but it's agency that we do in and through our comprehension and action. And so if you think of mind and will together, that is the speculative. The affective is the use of the heart. And that at times spirituality is understood through the engagement of the heart instead of the engagement of the head, would be one way to think about that. Does that make sense to you? The other one, though, is the more interesting one, and that is the apophatic and the cataphatic. Now, phos is image, and so this means either cataphatic means with imagery, apophatic means without imagery. Or cataphatic might mean with action, and apophatic without. And there are deep theological traditions around the apophatic tradition, including Pseudo-Dionysius, but others that basically say all of our language for God always falls short because God is not our language. And some of you who studied theology probably have run into even contemporary theologians who keep reminding us that we can't reduce God to our categories. And that would be an apophatic approach. Now, inside that, basically, he posits there are 4, and I wouldn't call these pristine views, but at least 4 kind of postures as the axes overlap. One of them is speculative cataphatic, and that's where we use our minds and engage imagery in such a way that it really engages us and radically and deepens our relationship with God in and through that. So that our life of the Spirit and life in the Spirit comes through the use of our mind and its radical engagement with imagery. And for the sake of time, if you've ever had a friend who took every Bible study that the church offered, if you had a friend that their first year and their undergraduate took an intro to Bible class and then took 18 hours of Greek, of Greek study, those would be the kind of people that would be at the height of this kind of an approach. Does that make sense? These are the people that through the very study of Scripture, their lives are deeply enriched, or the very study of theology. So if you've got a couple of friends that are real theology nerds, don't know if there's anybody here that qualifies, probably so, they would also fit within here. And the intricacy of the discussion of God using imagery about the very nature of God would be a part of why they would be a part of this sphere. But then there is also the affective cataphatic, where imagery does not so much engage the head as it moves the heart. And for tonight, we would just say that in some ways this becomes a way of using imagery that really, to some degree, inspires us, and it just awakens us. So the best example I can use of this, you may hear this one again at Convene, is that you have two friends who are in a worship service and they actually still sing hymns. All right. I know that's rare, but they do. And you have one person who's going, have you seen the lyrics in this hymn and what it says about God? And they're just enamored with that. Well, they're speculative cataphatic. And if the person right beside him says, I just love to sing to Jesus, it just moves my heart. And I'm just caught up in the melody. Well, affective cataphatic. Same imagery, but tends to move different aspects of who we are. Going, where's he going with this? Well, the other two versions actually are more the apophatic, where one way to think about speculative apophatic is that there's a tendency to use our mind and our will to try to overcome the obstacles that impede our journey to engage God. And so there is an attempt, if you will, to really deny ourselves certain things so that we might, in our denial, the apophatic, and our denial of those practices, it frees us then to truly engage God in its fullness. And there are aspects of asceticism that lean into this idea that in some ways, if I dedicate myself, discipline myself, train myself, both towards certain practices, but also away from certain snares in the world, then through that disengagement of the world, then God becomes present in the midst of my practice. Does that make sense to everyone? There is also within mysticism a similar approach, at least if you think about it, that in our withdrawal from the world and our engagement with God, the experience of God, and I don't want to use the word just emotional, but the deep affective change that happens to us comes in through those radical encounters. And Juan de la Cruz's sort of coaching, if you will, that all of our efforts to the contrary, there comes a moment where we just can't conjure God, but God becomes present regardless. That becomes a part of this apophatic affective movement. And so these two movements do have resonance in this sort of withdrawal from the world in a way, albeit for reason, for purpose, witness or encounter, but at least to understand that one's lives are dictated by something other than by the ordinary and customary ways in which we conduct our lives in the world today. We need some order. We need some way of finding a way of not being bound to the fullness of the distractions in this world, so that we free our lives in order to engage these kinds of encounters, either for the sake of the other, for the poor, for mission, for witness, or really in order to really truly experience God in and through these radical moments of encounter. Either way. Questions to this? We'll come back to this chart down the road, but I wanted to use it as a way of kind of helping you at least understand these two movements in light of a slightly different interpretive grid. And we'll use Holmes's work one or two more times before the semester is over with. Okay.
Professor Blevins, I do have a question, and forgive me, I'm just trying to keep up here. In so looking at this graph, from what I'm understanding, is the optimal location to be in the middle there,
Not
away
necessarily
from all those dangers?
There are entire traditions that set up shop in one or two of these specific categories. I mean, so trust me, if you go, I'm right in the center. Yeah, good luck with that, right? Actually, in some ways, it's more how different traditions shape and form one's encounter across these sort of sensibilities of prayer is one way to think about it, and why it's important. So no, I wouldn't use this prescriptively of wanting to be suddenly, well, if not Malcolm in the middle, Stephen in the middle. I would not think about it that way. It's really more to kind of use the crosshatches or the tensions of the polarities, just to be honest, polarities from that standpoint. And I think that's more helpful. One way that you use this, though, is to start thinking about your own spiritual journey and which of those four categories might, and I want you to hear that is very awkward technical language, so I want you to wrestle with it, but which one of these tends to kind of be closer to where your experience of the Christian life, your being of and in the spirit, what that looks like tends to be part of them. I'll talk about the dangers later. I don't want to tie us up with that tonight. I just want us to be kind of playing with this as an alternative way of kind of charting where we are within our own spiritual journey from that standpoint. Okay? All right. Truthfully, and this last slide is here mainly just to remind ourselves, even as we move to the second part of Sheldrake's book, that this is not the only way to kind of begin thinking about different expressions of the spiritual life. I've really been impressed by a book that's now pretty old in its writing, Margaret Miles and her understanding of practicing spirituality, because one of the things she was really concerned about was, does this continuum dominate the way all of the study of Christian spirituality occurs? And she basically said, not when you start focusing on how people practice their lives outside of these two continuums. And she is one of the first people I knew that began to say, when you start looking at how people live out their lives, their spiritual and engage their spiritual journey, they don't neatly fit those two paradigms alone. And she called for something that we'll talk a lot about as the semester goes along, a kind of hermeneutic of generosity, to kind of take people from where they live their lives and how they understand their spiritual journeys and how they understand what this life of and in the spirit looks like, and begin to think about then how they sort of encounter the world around themselves. She, in her book, she talks about three. The bottom one, the last of the three, looks pretty familiar. Staying is nowhere, ascent. Though I'll come back to that in a minute. But the other two are actually languages that we probably are going to encounter before the semester is over with. The image of the image, a kind of imitation of Christ, that my Christian life is through this. And yes, it is a kind of focus on Christian lifestyle. And Thomas à Kempis and others have sort of captured that vision. The idea of a society of aliens. And she spends a lot of time writing about pilgrimage and the way in which community becomes a way of guiding pilgrims, particularly as they travel together. Probably the best popular rendition of this is Canterbury Tales, where in some sense they are moving, they're transients moving through a strange land. And what's really fascinating is pilgrimages are as much about the journey as they are about the destination. And that becomes one of the most interesting ways in which she understands then the Christian life through this practicing Christianity, as well as back to staying as nowhere, this notion of climbing to union with God, where she talks about a little bit different from Wanda LaCruz. She talks about both an active and passive, and does it necessarily have to be merely a passive or an apophatic, or could there be active ways to enter into this union with God as well? And I find her very helpful. I only introduce her this week as just to remind us as we move to next week's reading with Sheldrake, there are other imagery out there that can help us to think about what Christian spirituality looks like and what best represents it. And to use my categories from last week, particularly when we begin thinking about a particular history in a particular context in which people live. I will also finish tonight. If you ran across a writer that or a name that Sheldrake used and described, since he normally lifts up certain exemplars, and you're curious about them, maybe for the project in this class, there is a set of books called Classics of Western Spirituality. It's a series that was done by Paulus Press. At the time when I pulled this slide, it said there was 126 volumes. I think it's bigger than that. And that is probably one of the series that has some of the best introductions to each and every one of these writers. And so if you're interested in John of the Cross, there is an entire book that includes both excerpts as well as an introduction to John of the Cross. And if you think that's someone you might want to know more about, or Bernard of Clairvaux, or Saint Benedict, or others, as we continue to read, I'll commend to you this as a good place to begin engaging. They even have a volume on John and Charles Wesley, volume on St. Augustine, but they're always interested in how, and they actually have some volumes that are non-Christian, but they often tend to relate those traditions then back to Christianity. And they do tend to give a reasonable one-volume introduction to these different movements, as well as different figures within Christian spirituality. And so I hope this helps as you're thinking about who you might study and who you might engage coming out of Sheldrake's work. Okay. All right. That takes us into, that ends tonight's presentation. Got just a couple of minutes. Any questions so far that you have? Any lingering thoughts out of this presentation and this conversation? John?
I mean, I think my frustration from my post is still kind of there, that spirituality as the term is still kind of vague and difficult to define. And I don't feel like that's going to be clarified in one class in seminary if it's something that people have wrestled with for decades, generations, whatever.
2 centuries, at least from that standpoint. So yes, and go ahead.
I will say though that the clarification tonight of these two different, what I would say are just essentially streams of Christianity in asceticism and mysticism. If we want to put them as spirituality, that I can work with that. So this was a helpful lecture for sure. I just, I think as long as it's okay that I frame it as liturgy and worship and spirituality, like the life that we live as Christians, that's fine. And so that's helpful if that's where we're going.
Okay, and it is. There are, I mean, though, I would say what really, and I'm not as purist as some other people, so that this is more spirituality, and even theology is practical theology. So as we'll get to that, there are certain exemplars within this that I would not say are just ordinary and everyday Christians, for lack of a better way of saying it, either in the nature of the experiences they have or in the radical commitment to a particular form of life. that they bind themselves to often. Not that they always start it, but they do then bind themselves to. I don't like, and we'll talk more about this, I think, as the semester unfolds. I don't like super spirituality. So I hope you hear that, which sometimes these kinds of approaches tend to imply. But I do think there are peculiar expressions of life, both of the spirit and in the spirit, that are demanding that certain people find themselves within, but others do not. And I think that's something for us to just be mindful of as we walk through a lot of this work. I actually wrote a chapter, for instance, on the saints. I'm about to eat up all the time in this one response. That just reminds us that the church does need saints at times, just to trouble the just so understanding of what the church is, to mess with our heads, so to speak, on how we understand church. And I think within these movements, there are those exceptional moments of these movements that at least invite our attention and really challenge us to think, would I live that kind of life, or how might I live that kind of life? So I'll leave with that. Any other questions, concerns as we wrap up? All right. 2 hours go fast. Let me just say that. And so the kind of rhythm of small group engagement that sometimes we've done in the past will, as the semester unfolds, I'm hoping we'll have more time for that. But I hope you hear that we're starting early in the semester, so I did want to kind of anchor us through these first couple of presentations. And then my hope is by the time we get to convene, we'll have enough on our palate, so to speak, that when we meet face to face, we can begin to try to relate this material to each other and through some synthetic work. Does that make sense? Okay. Well, normally we'll end a small group. Tonight, I would like to close us in prayer. Everybody has prayer books, and I have a bunch. I think I indicated that last week. This is one that I chanced upon, so much so that it still has the half-price books tacked on the front of it. But it is Prayers Encircling the World was the title of the book. It's an international anthology. And this is just a very small prayer from a movement in Italy, that I just thought might be a kind of admonition as we end tonight. It's not a blessing, it's a way to think. So let me pray this prayer. Lord, may I ever speak as though it were the last word that I can speak. May I ever act as though it was the last action that I can perform. May I ever suffer as though it were the last pain that I can offer. May I ever pray as though it were for me on earth, the last chance to speak to you. Amen. Blessings to everyone. We will see you. And if you have questions, you can always reach out to me by email. You know that. But we will see you next week. Okay. From the airport in DFW. So we'll see how that works out. Be praying for me for that. Okay. Take care.